Great. Good afternoon, participants. We'll get started in just a few moments. Thank you for being here. And again, we'll start in another 90 seconds.
Thank you, Dean Brady. Good to see you in person.
Oh, hi, Ahmad. How are you? Yes. No, it's good. How's your son?
He's better. It was a 2-day thing, 2-day stomach bug, and now he's back to it. Yeah, thank you.
Good. Oh, gosh. I remember it all.
All right. We'll give people another 30 seconds and then we'll get started. Okay, everyone. Well, I think we've got a critical mass. We'll let people join as they are able. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Leroy Munoz. I serve as the General Counsel and Senior Vice President of Tech Policy for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. It is my pleasure on behalf of the Leadership Group, as well as our CEO, Ahmad Thomas, to introduce you to someone who I've known personally for many years, Henry Brady. Henry Brady is an award-winning author who has served as the Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley since 2009. He is an award-winning author and a thought leader on policy in all manner of forms here in the United States. Truly somebody we are lucky to have. He has a wealth of knowledge and just a tremendous background in politics and policy. And Dean, before we let people in, I was.
Ooh.
It looks like we may have lost Peter there.
We may have lost Peter.
All right. Well, I'll just jump in.
And I hope I'm back. Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Peter.
Okay. Perfect. So we were talking earlier about just how incredibly important this moment is in American history and politics, given what we saw last week, and now the transition to a new presidency. Dean, we're so fortunate to have you giving us your insights.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Peter. Kristen, we'll turn to you to continue with the program.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We are so excited to have Dean Henry Brady with us to share a bit about politics and policy in America in 2021. Dean Brady is an award-winning author who has served as the Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy since 2009. He's written on electoral politics and political participation, social welfare policy, political polling, political polarization and trust, and statistical methodology. His most recent book, published in 2018, is titled Unequal and Unrepresented: Political Inequality in the New Gilded Age. Dean Brady was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2003 and a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2006. And he has worked for the Federal Office of Management and Budget and other organizations in Washington, D.C. We are thrilled to have Dean Brady joining us today to speak to his insights for, as I mentioned, politics and policy in America in 2021. Please join me this afternoon in welcoming Dean Brady.
It's great to be here. What a time. What a time. It's an honor to speak before this group for which I have such a tremendous admiration and that has done such great work. Let me see if I can try to help you understand, although I can't actually quite say that I understand all that's going on in America right now. I've taken to doing things like reading about the Whig Party and reading about Reconstruction after the Civil War and just trying to look for historical parallels and places to try to get some insight. And I'll probably talk about some of those things as we go along. I want to talk about 4 things today. The loss of trust in social institutions, which I think is something that really is worrisome and I think will have long-term consequences and something we all have to worry about. I want to talk about the nature of Trump voters and his legacy, because I think it's important to understand where they're coming from, what they look like, and where they might be going. And then finally, the makeup and future of the Republican Party takes me through the politics part of the presentation. And then I want to get to a policy part, which is the agenda and policy initiatives of the Biden administration. I want to do that pretty quickly so that we have time for questions, because I know that all of you, I'm sure, have been thinking a lot about these issues and probably have a lot of questions. Let me start with loss of trust in social institutions. These are just some headlines from various sources about the loss of trust in various social institutions. And it's the police, it's the mass media, it's government, and just generally collapse of trust. Let me show you the question that I'm using as the basis for some of the data I'm going to show you. It's how much confidence do you have in institution name, the police, the media, business, labor, the president, whatever. And it's a 5-point scale from complete confidence to no confidence. And what's worrisome is we're moving down the scale. So let me just show you something. It looks rather crazy, but it's a chart of trust in the presidency broken out by 3 groups. The trust that Democrats have for the presidency, that's in blue, in the sort of standard way that we now identify Democrats. They're blue states. And then in red is the trust by Republicans. And then in purple, the in-between color and the dashed, the dotted, are independents. And what you note here as we go from 1972 onwards, we have, of course, changes in the presidency. And every time we get a new president, the 2 lines switch. That's not a surprise. Republicans are more trustful of Republican presidents. So the red line is on top whenever there's a president who's a red-coded president, like Reagan or H.W. Bush or G.W. Bush or Trump. And then the blue is on top whenever there's a Democrat. And yeah, okay, so that's not a surprise that Democrats like Democrats and Republicans like Republicans. What is a surprise is to really look at this for a moment and see what's happening over time. And these 2 black dotted arrows try to show you what's happened, is that over time, the partisans of the party in power have become slightly more positive about their person in the White House. But most importantly, the partisans of the out party have become more and more negative about the person in the White House. So we see what we call scissoring. I once, by the way, gave this talk at University of Florida, and I started to demonstrate scissoring, which is where you take your arms and you spread them apart. And everybody started really showing tremendous animation. And then I realized that that was, of course, the sign for the Gators. And so that's why they were showing so much animation. It had nothing to do with the excitement they felt from my talk. It had to do with the fact that I was gatoring. But that's what's happening. The jaws of the gator are opening. And that's not a bad metaphor. So that's really worrisome. Here's another chart. I'm going to have to take a moment to explain it. But what it does is on this 5-point scale, it plots the location of Democratic partisans versus Republican partisans on these trust or confidence measures. So over on the left-hand side, you see labor. And this is around 1974 from a whole lot of different surveys that we put together into a big database. And you find that, not surprisingly, Democrats in 1974 are more positive about labor than Republicans. And then on the right-hand side, about the middle, you see that Republicans are more positive about business than Democrats. And so what I've done is I've circled them and I've labeled the institution and also put it in the color of the bias. In this case, Democrat for labor, Republican for business. And the interesting thing here is that in 1974, the cleavage structure of American politics was such that, yes, partisans had different opinions of business and labor. That was a cleavage that goes back to the New Deal, at least, probably way before then. We don't know. We haven't had survey data since the 30s. But what's interesting is all these other institutions were basically within these 2 dashed lines, which are about 0.2 of a point away from the center line, which we judge to be not much difference, or to put it another way, much less difference than the difference between labor and business. And these institutions include the press, TV, law, lawyers, police, K through 12 education, higher education, religion, the military, banks, science, and medicine. So in 1974, most Americans were agreed that these institutions were trustworthy, and they were about equally agreed. Now, they had different notions of which were more than trustworthy than others, but basically most of them lie along the purple line, which would be the line if in fact everybody totally agreed from a partisan perspective on the trustworthiness of each institution. So now just keep in mind that, and now look at this from 2014. What's happened is trust, and especially partisan trust, has changed dramatically since 1974 and the 40 years since then. Suddenly, all of these institutions are going out from the purple line, they're moving outward, and there's tremendous partisan bias for the institutions. And what's interesting is to look at which institutions have what partisan bias. Higher education, K through 12 education, TV news, and the press are more trusted by Democrats than Republicans. These are the knowledge producing institutions, the ones that give us our facts and our ideas. On the other hand, religion, police, and military, which you might call the law and order or norm producing institutions in a society, are more trusted by Republicans. This is an extraordinary change, and it means that in fact, the partisans of the two parties are going to two different camps with two different sets of institutions that they trust for guidance and leadership. For the Republicans, it's religion, police, the military. For Democrats, it's higher education, K through 12, TV news, and the press. And you might notice that science is right on the borderline there towards the top of the diagram. And what's interesting is it used to be trusted more by Republicans than by Democrats. Now it's trusted more by Democrats than Republicans. So it's actually moved a great distance, and it appears to be moving further. So that's the first thing. Trust is changing in America in ways that is worrisome because these institutions are fundamental to getting things done. Think about recent debates about the police. Think about recent debates about the reliability of science. Think about the recent debates about the reliability of healthcare knowledge. These institutions are not as credible across the partisan divide as they used to be. Okay, Trump voters. I think we have to have a sense of who and what they are in order to understand what might happen in the next 4, 10, 15 years. What I'm doing is I'm actually going back to data from 2016. And this is data from the primary, actually, a survey that was done in primary of Americans. It was a national survey, but it was a question about the primary candidates. At that time, Senator Sanders was an outsider running. There was Secretary of State Clinton, Hillary Clinton, an insider. Then there were independents. Then there were Republicans, a bunch of insiders, the governors, Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, John Kasich, Senator Rubio from Florida, an insider as well, an outsider, Ben Carson, another person who at least styles himself as an outsider, Ted Cruz, and finally, of course, somebody who absolutely is an outsider, Donald Trump. And I put them in this order because, as you'll see, that actually helps order the data. And what I'm doing now is here from left to right, Sanders on the left, Trump on the right, are these candidates. And I tell you that in this survey, the percentage of respondents supporting each candidate. And as we know, Sanders and Clinton were close in terms of support. Trump was outdistancing the field among the Republicans. I'm going to use this same left-right orientation to start looking at characteristics of the various people voting for or claiming they had preferences for these various candidates. And here's two questions about: are you born again, the percentage born again, and are you a frequent religious attender? And they basically go along about the same way. Sanders people are secular, but also interestingly, Trump's people are pretty secular in 2016. It's the Carson, Rubio, Cruz supporters who are actually religious. So, but nevertheless, what's interesting here is to see that the outsiders were both picking up support from people who were really not that religious. Educational level. Again, the outsiders had the people with less education. And by the way, the income is about the same. The outsiders were picking up lower income, less educated people. So we're starting to get a picture of Trump voters and of Sanders voters for that matter, and of the people in between. So Sanders voters were not very religious, not very educated, and 75% white. Trump supporters were not that religious, low education, and 91% white. And then in between were the other voters supporting other candidates. So what did differentiate Trump and Sanders voters? Well, how about attitudes towards economic issues? Is it harder to succeed now than in the past? Well, as we find, actually, Sanders and Trump supporters are agreed on this issue. They both think it's harder to succeed in America than it used to be in the past. And notice it's really sort of astonishing that we get essentially the same for the outsiders. And it tells you something about the group of people supporting outside candidates. They're worried about their future in America. They're not sure they belong or have a chance to belong. Okay, how about free trade? Well, basically the same thing. Trump supporters are somewhat more in opposition to free trade, but Sanders supporters were as well. It's the folks in between, the candidates in between, who get those people who are in favor of free trade. So far we have found no differences between Trump and Sanders voters. Okay, now we're about to find a big difference. And I did not, by the way, plot the results for African Americans, and they are absolutely the same as for these other groups. But I wanted to show you that it was, in fact, a generalized xenophobia on the part of Trump voters. Republicans on the Trump side who voted for Trump, the far right of that diagram, are the least positive towards gays and lesbians, feminists, Muslims, and African Americans, and other ethnic and minority groups. Sanders voters are the most positive. So now we finally found a big difference. And it has to do with identity, and it has to do with xenophobia on the part of the Trump supporters. Here's another place where there's a difference. Trump supporters are very worried about a terror attack. That goes with their xenophobia, their fear of outsiders, their concern about the fact that America is under attack. And then the final characteristic is, how important is your identity as an American? This is the Make America Great Again, the MAGA fundamental question. And the answer is, for Trump supporters, it's incredibly fundamental. For Sanders supporters, it's not particularly important. So we now have a pretty good picture of what makes Trump and Sanders voters similar, but also what makes them really quite different fundamentally. Okay, so what does this tell us about the future of the Republican Party? Well, the Republican Party historically has had four pieces to it. And I'm trying to depict these pieces along two different dimensions. Along the bottom is an economic dimension, whether the members of that group are conservative on economic issues, to the right, or moderate on economic issues. And then along the vertical axis, I have a dimension, a social dimension, that has to do with opinions about social issues, cultural issues, prayer in the schools, abortion, gay and lesbian marriage, those kinds of issues. In the conservative block in the upper right-hand corner, we have traditional conservatives. Although, frankly, most traditional conservatives, and by the way, I give you examples of them. George W. Bush was a traditional conservative. John Kasich, Chris Christie, Marco Rubio, three of the candidates in the 2016 primaries, were in fact traditional conservatives, as was Jeb Bush. And they're basically focused on business and the relationship of the Republican Party to business. Then we go to white Christian fundamentalists in the left-hand side at the top. They're very concerned about religion and social issues. They're very conservative on those issues, but pretty moderate on the economic dimension, partly because white Christian fundamentalists tend to have relatively low income compared certainly to traditional conservatives. Then down in the lower left-hand corner is the new group that's been mobilized by Trump, and that's the populist right, with a tremendous concern for national identity. And frankly, behind that, more than a hint of racism. In fact, studies suggest a substantial amount of racist sentiment. The populist right, Pat Buchanan, was the first person to push this agenda. Donald Trump has taken it up and made it successful. And then finally, there's libertarians. They actually have their own party and ran their own candidate in 2016, Gary Johnson. Their focus is more on free markets and liberty. Now, we could spend a lot of time discussing each of these four groups, but I really don't want to get into a lot of detail about their ideologies and their perspectives, but I hope they're familiar to you and they ring a bell. I think the situation is that we're now in a circumstance where traditional conservatives worked with white Christian fundamentalists to put together an agenda where Ronald Reagan, for example, had tax cuts and deregulation, and then as much as possible humored, and that actually is what some of his advisors described it as, humored the right wing, the white Christian fundamentalists on the social issues. So he was willing to go along with being anti-abortion and so on and so forth. That's been the traditional coalition. Populist right was not much in evidence. And libertarians, as I say, had their own party and sort of played their own game, although they ultimately typically ended up voting Republican, except in those circumstances when somebody like a Ross Perot came along, in which case they might bolt from the party and create the election in '92 that led to George Herbert Walker Bush losing to Bill Clinton. So what's happening? Well, I think we're in a situation where we're about to have a dissolution of the Republican Party that looks like the Whigs in the 1850s. First, the Whigs were a pretty weak party. Republicans are a stronger party, actually, and they've had some people who have been very successful. Eisenhower, certainly, Reagan, certainly, as successful candidates. The Whigs only actually won 2 elections, 1840 and 1848, both with famous generals, both of whom proceeded to die within about in one case, a month of being inaugurated, and in the other case, within about a year, and leading to very undistinguished vice presidents taking over. No Whig was really particularly successful, but they did win 2 presidential elections. The Whigs broke apart with different stances on identity politics, immigration and slavery, and governing, what the power of the federal government should be. The Know-Nothings, which became the American Party, were nativist. Think about this in the Trump voters, anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. The Trump voters are not anti-Catholic. In fact, a sizable proportion of the Trump voters are Catholics, working class Catholics who used to be Democrats and who are now Republicans, and also against a strong federal government. That was actually a continuation of the Whigs, who had started in opposition to Andrew Jackson and his national bank and his other, in what they moves which they thought were autocratic. The remainder became the Republican Party. Anti-slavery, not to begin with, mostly to begin with, in fact, against the extension of slavery, but eventually an anti-slavery party, pro-union, and for a strong federal government, again, not actually to begin with, but as time went on and as the secession occurred, as the Confederate States formed, as the Civil War began, the Republican Party became a party that believed in a strong federal government led by Lincoln. The question is this going to happen in the Republican Party, like the Whigs? I think it's quite conceivable, if you look on the left-hand side of this diagram, that the new core now, at least for part of the Republican Party, is white Christian fundamentalists and the populist right. I think the 140 or so Republicans in the House who voted against the certification of the election on January 6th really are pretty much in those camps: white Christian fundamentalists, populist right. Traditional conservatives are the Lynn Cheneys of this world, the George W. Bushes of this world, the Mitt Romneys of this world. And they really have an uncertain future in the Republican Party. And the libertarians, as I say, that's the Ron Pauls of this of the world, and Rand Pauls. they're not clear either where they're going to be. They're certainly not very sympathetic to a lot of what's been going on in the among the 140 members of the House who voted against certification. And it's not clear where they're going. And, or to put it another way, it's not clear which of these two groups is going to win out, the one on the left or the one on the right. And notice, by the way, the one on the left is not much concerned about economic issues, except insofar as they want jobs for working class people. They're against free trade. They're against globalization. They're for America first. They're for jobs in America. They don't seem to have much concern about deficit spending, which traditional conservative Republicans have. So this is going to make a big change in the Republican Party if the left side there wins, in which case economic issues will take a different cast than if the traditional group wins. And that's what we're seeing right now, is a fight within the party over who's going to be in charge.
Yeah.
Okay, where does that lead us? Well, right now, I think it leads us in a situation where the future of the Republican Party is not clear. There's a battle going on to see who's going to take it over. Will it be Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and the folks on the left? Will it be the Mitt Romneys and the Lynn Cheneys and the folks on the right of that diagram, or somebody else? And this is the backdrop against which Joe Biden is becoming president. So how does he have to think about his presidency? Well, first of all, don't try to do a Jimmy Carter. Don't try to put forth so many initiatives that basically they clog up the system. And that's especially true since there's really two enormously important things he's got to do. He's got to deal with the COVID recovery, and he's got to deal with the economic recovery. And he's got to do that in the backdrop of a House in which the Democrats have an advantage, but it's only about 10 votes. And in a Senate where the advantage is razor thin, with, in fact, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, breaking the ties. And then there's questions of what will happen with the filibuster, because that could lead to problems in getting legislation through the Senate. So that's the focus that the Biden administration has to have. But there's so much more to be done. They've talked about fixing Obamacare and extending health care. They've talked about developing an energy and climate policy. And if you look at the appointments that have been made, including our faculty member, Jennifer Granholm, to the Department of Energy, there's a tremendous focus on trying to come up with an energy climate policy that will also provide jobs to Americans. That's going to be a recurrent theme in this administration, that a good energy policy, a good energy independence policy, a good climate policy can produce jobs. And so that's what we're going to be seeing. There's also the lingering issue that one suspected Donald Trump might take care of. And frankly, I think he would have been wise to focus on that instead of Obamacare early in his administration. And that was infrastructure. I think the 2018 elections would have been totally different if on every street corner there'd been people doing infrastructure projects funded by Donald Trump. And I think that was a tremendous missed opportunity on his part. And it's still there, a need to do that. Biden is talking about infrastructure with his recovery plans. So he's not going to miss that opportunity, it seems.
Okay, I have reward points.
And then there's the question of raising taxes. Biden has talked about raising taxes, especially corporate income taxes and the marginal tax rate on personal incomes. And I think he would very much like to do it. He's going to need the money to finance some of what he's trying to do. But that's going to be a hard sell to Republicans. And so it's going to be interesting to see how far he gets on that. Then there's regulatory and governance issues. Improving voting systems is certainly going to be on the agenda, and they need improvement, although they're not as fraudulent and problematic as Donald Trump says. I've done a lot of research in this area. I was actually an expert witness in the butterfly ballot case in 2000 in Palm Beach County in Florida. And for the last 20 years, I've kept track of that and done a lot of research in the area. And all of the claims of Donald Trump are essentially fraudulent. There's sure a little bit of truth, but there's not 5,000 people who were dead who voted in Georgia. there may be two. That's not enough to change the election result. Then there's this ongoing issue of the Supreme Court. Should it be packed? Should it not be packed? Should we go for 18-year terms? How should we reform the Supreme Court, if at all? And then the one that's probably very important to folks from Silicon Valley is dealing with social media, the internet monopoly and regulation in the area of social media and the internet. And this is going to be a big, big issue. And there, what's interesting is to see how there's many people among Trump supporters who very much want to break up the monopolies of the media company because they feel that they've been pro-Biden. Okay, what might be relatively easy? Well, I think extending healthcare in the midst of a pandemic might be pretty easy, although there's a Supreme Court case still to come forth on that might make things very complicated if certain aspects of the program are found to be unconstitutional. The $15 minimum wage, Biden's already talking about that. That's very popular in opinion polling. It really is actually long overdue. Minimum wage has not been increased much for a long, long time, and it's about time to get it back to where it used to be. So it's not even back where it used to be. Some stimulus will be pretty easy, and infrastructure might be relatively easy. But at least three things are going to be hard. The size of the deficit. It's going to be interesting to see if deficit hawks come back amongst the Republican Party. They were not much in evidence during the Trump years, but there is certainly a contingent, especially of traditional conservatives and libertarians, who are utterly opposed for different reasons to deficits. Some of them are opposed because they just think that an institution like the federal government should not go into great debt and that it's dangerous to do so. Another argument against doing that is just that means you're spending lots of money and the government doesn't spend money wisely, and therefore they're against deficits for that reason. By the way, economic opinion on this topic has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. It used to be that economists thought that excess and large debts as a percentage of GDP were a bad idea. They're less and less sure that's true. There was a presidential address by one of my classmates actually at MIT, Olivier Blanchard, where Olivier made the argument that in fact, when interest rates are so low, there's every argument to borrow money because government could invest it more profitably than just not borrowing it and not investing it. So there's a big change, a sea change theoretically on that topic. Raising taxes is going to be tremendously hard for all the standard reasons. And then regulation of social media, I think, is going to be at least complex, if not hard. It's certainly going to be complex to try to figure out how to do it right. So that's it. And I'm open for questions. So just to summarize quickly, loss of trust in social institutions is the backdrop against which we have to do everything. Trump voters and their legacy, we have a group of people who are focused on national identity, who are strongly, many of them have racist tendencies. We're in some sense in a moment of a second reconstruction right now with Black Lives Matter. Those folks are not in favor of that. The makeup and the future of the Republican Party is completely up for grabs. And the agenda and policy initiatives of the Biden administration, some of them are pretty straightforward, but some of them are going to create real difficulties and be hard to get through given the close situation both in the House and the Senate. Questions? How do we do this? Because
Dean Brady, this is Peter LaRome Munoz again.
Yep.
Hi, Dean. I had a quick question for you.
Sure.
My question is, with the upcoming Senate impeachment trial, something like that is going to really suck the oxygen out of DC and take up quite a bit of bandwidth. How do you see that impacting the president-elect's first 100 days in office and his ability to deliver on some of the projects or policies that you spoke about?
Yeah, no, I should have mentioned the impeachment, obviously, the impeachment trial actually now, because the impeachment is finished. Now we're into the trial of whether or not Donald Trump will be convicted. Yeah, I think it's going to be something. I think, on the other hand, the Democrats really, I think personally, had to go forward with a statement and had to go through the House and have an article of impeachment. So that was a necessary thing. And I think now they're going to have to play it out. The trouble is, as you say, that could crowd out other things that need to be done. Such simple things, by the way, as getting members of the cabinet confirmed. So I know that, for example, Jennifer Granholm is now wondering about when they're going to move forward with her confirmation. So yeah, I think that's an issue. On the other hand, I do think that they have no choice but to do it. They've got to do it. And they're trying to think of some ways, such as split sessions, to perhaps do it. It's not clear that that's allowed under the rules of the Senate and in the rules of impeachment trials. And so that might mean they'd want to do it as fast as they can. On the other hand, there's an argument to be made that you want to do it slowly and deliberately to make sure you amass all the evidence. So that's going to be a problem. That adds a monkey wrench into the first 100 days, which is the time when most presidents get going on their legislative agenda. So I think it's a problem, but it's one of those problems that I don't think can be avoided. And who is going to be monitoring questions? I'm happy to just have people speak up.
Dean Brady, we've got Kristen who's monitoring the chat
Okay.
here, and I saw one that came in. We're hoping to keep it informal for folks to raise hands or speak up.
Sure.
I have a question after this one, Kristen.
The question is, do I see the country shifting from a two-party system? And the answer is, there are just powerful forces which create a two-party system when we have what we have, which are single-member districts with what's called first past the post voting systems. That is to say, whoever gets the most votes of the two candidates wins. And the reasons are twofold. In such systems, people who are voting worry about a wasted vote if they vote for a third-party candidate. So that's a reason why people don't necessarily vote for third-party candidates like a Ross Perot or like a John Anderson from 1980. The second reason is that candidates see it to be a dangerous idea to go in and become a candidate as a third-party candidate because they know the strong forces that push towards just two parties being involved in elections. I should say too, is that also there's one thing the two parties have agreed upon with respect to legislation across the states, and that is that there should only really be two parties. And so there's a lot of legislation that makes it very difficult to get on ballots as a third party candidate in various states. So it's very hard for a third party to get going. Of course, right now, given the perilous and parlous condition of the Republican Party, it's conceivable that it would break into two parties for a while. I'm sure that people like Mitch McConnell are deeply worried about that, and they're trying to figure out ways to avoid it happening, but it's possible. Note that one reason it might not is that if the Republican Party splits into two parts in the Senate or the House or both, that's going to make it very hard for them to have any influence whatsoever. And the Democrats would love that because it obviously would make them more able to get their legislation through. So there's just a lot of forces in American politics that make it hard to have a third party. Ahmad.
Thank you so much, Dean Brady, for speaking here today. We'll have this recorded so we can blast it out to our executives. A great talk, very, very topical. And you'll see I'll give you a shout out first, several of our big employers here in Silicon Valley. I've been very impressed learning more about the Goldman School, how analytical the program is. And we want to look for more partnership opportunities with SVLG and with your students and graduates and our member companies. So thank you again. The question I have is really spurred by the insurrection at the Capitol we saw just a few days ago and related to your expertise around voting systems. And the question is, how did we get to that point where we could not have a common set of agreed upon facts related to the outcome of the election? Are Democrats to blame for not speaking up forcefully at the beginning as some of these claims were coming? Is it the media and how it was reported? Because clearly we are at a stage where millions of Americans believe this was a fraudulent election. The gaslighting's real. I don't even know what's real sometimes watching the news and watching some of the rallies we see.
Yeah, let me first to say that I have done a lot of work on research on voting systems and know a lot about it. And every time Donald Trump would make a set of statements about claims about what was going on, I would go and track them down. And I have not found an iota of evidence to support his claims. Yes, of course, as I said, maybe 5,000, not 5,000 voters in Georgia who were dead voted, but 2 did. That's par for the course in elections. And 2 voters in Georgia is not going to change the outcome. So at the periphery, at the edges, there are problems with respect to the voting systems. But they're nowhere near big enough to lead to a reversal of the result we just saw. How did we get here? I think it's 2 things. One is Donald Trump constantly, incessantly repeating refrains which were absolutely untrue. He just made it up and kept making it up. And no amount of evidence obviously changed his mind about anything, even though they were wild, false, and just hopelessly, in some cases, stupid claims. And I just can't say it more forcefully. But by him doing that, he misled his supporters big time. I think another thing that did that, of course, is social media. And we continue to have a problem with there are pockets out there on social media where people just talk to one another. So, for example, I was listening to C-SPAN this morning, not CNN, yeah, C-SPAN. And we were talking about voting fraud. And a gentleman called in and he said, well, there was somebody that was just arrested in Texas who made up 7,000 votes. So I went and tracked that down. Well, there's no indication in any of the reports that the person did anything like that. It looks like the person might have helped a voter vote. And under certain circumstances, that's not really legal. It also looks like the Attorney General of Texas, who you may remember was one of the persons who was trying to bring a Supreme Court case to decertify the election, is using this as a political tactic to try to prove that he was right, that there was fraud. So this poor woman has been arrested for what I suspect in the end will turn out to be perhaps infractions, but relatively minor ones, and certainly not ones involving 7,000 voters, even though the caller to C-SPAN this morning was making the claim that that's what was going on. Where did that caller get that information? My guess is if I worked harder, I would find some reports somewhere on the internet where it started out where she did this, and pretty soon it's 7,000 votes. And that's the kind of multiplication that occurs, as many of you know, on the internet that can be just so dangerous. All of that said, we could have better voting systems. In 2000, I was involved with the butterfly ballot case. I felt then that the state of Florida's voting systems and many other states were just really not acceptable and that we needed reform. We got a thing called the Help America Vote Act, but that was pretty much undercut by a variety of stratagems of state and especially local registrars who didn't want to give up the power to regulate those systems. What we need to do is finally have some national standards for those systems. Most importantly, we need to have work that looks at auditing elections afterwards to make sure that every step in the election passed muster. And my colleague, Philip Stark in the statistics department here has come up with a concept of risk audits and evidence-based elections, which I think if followed, and 4 states are doing it right now, if followed, would mean that after an election, at least those of us who read the facts would say, yes, that proves to me that in fact everything was done properly. I'm not sure that can stop, however, a president who just wants to willfully and incessantly lie like Donald Trump did. And that, of course, is part of the story behind the insurrection we saw on January 6th, is his willingness to just go on and on and on about fraudulent claims.
So, Dean Henry, this is Dan Kostenbauer from the Leadership Group. A question: you focused significantly on the sort of tensions within the Republican Party. Do you sense that on the Democrat side, the sort of progressive element versus sort of the mainstream Democrats, is that anywhere near as strong a division as you see, materializing or developing in the Republican side?
I think it's a division, but it's a policy division. The division within the Republican side is really almost a constitutional division. There was a great essay by a Yale historian, Anthony Snyder, in which he talked about two groups within the Republican Party, which roughly parallel the two oblongs that I were talking about. And he talks about the breakers, people who want to break the system because they want power. And I think the Christian fundamentalists, and I think the populist right especially, are quite willing to break the system, to go to an autocracy, to get rid of fair elections, if that means they can retain power. Because they think that so much is at stake, culturally, racially, and so forth, that they just really want to get power at any cost. And then there's within the Republican Party, the gamers. And the gamers have been the people who've traditionally gone along, as I said, like Ronald Reagan. What he really cared about was making sure that there was more free enterprise, that there was less regulation. But he went along and he did things to have a sop, basically, to the Christian fundamentalists. The trouble is now is that in that group, it's not just the Christian fundamentalists, it's this nationalist, racist, populist right, which has a very strong breaker agenda. And the gamers went along because it meant they got power. Mitch McConnell would be a good example of a gamer. He got to put in power a whole lot of judges that he wanted to put in power and get other things done that he wanted to get done, like a tax cut. The gamers now have to make the decision whether it's gone too far. And it looks like some of them have. Lynn Cheney's obvious, maybe even Mitch McConnell by some reports. And that's really the issue for the Republican Party. The danger within the Republican Party is there are people who are really, truly anti-democratic. Now, it may be true that in the Democratic, big D Democratic Party, there are people who believe in what some folks would call socialism. But frankly, if you look at it, it's a social welfare state agenda. It's not really socialism, or certainly not communism. They're not talking about the government taking over industry. I haven't heard that actually put forth by anybody. So they're talking about a more extensive social welfare agenda. And the social welfare state has been the compromise between those who believe in free reign capitalism and those who believe that capitalism has its faults and that things have to be done to solve the problems that are created by capitalism or that are ancillary to capitalism. So I don't think that the divergence within the Democratic Party is as problematic as the divergence within the Republican Party.
Thank you.
Dean Brady, I see our leadership group colleague Pedro Espinoza has his hand raised
Sure,
here. I think
please.
he might have a question. If you want to unmute yourself, Pedro.
Dean Henry, such an honor meeting you. I went to Berkeley as well, and President Napolitano gave me an Entrepreneurship Award of the Year. My question is for the new Biden administration, what would President Biden need to do to unite this country in tangible steps, right? Because, I mean, I was born and raised in Peru, very different country than the US, but what would our president need to do to get those fundamentalists, as you're saying, those nationalists, and getting those progressive and more pro-social welfare people together, both in the party and in the Senate?
Yeah, there's four ways where you increase trust or legitimacy. One way is you just basically appeal to authority. So the police are legitimate because we as a government have given them legitimacy. It's not clear that that works so well anymore. So that route's probably not open to Joe Biden, but of course he can also respect authority and show that it should be respected. The three other ways are maybe more available to him. One is subtle but important, and that's cultural. To try to show that he respects all different cultures and perspectives. So on the one hand, you see Biden not supporting defund the police, but he does say that policing has to be just and fair. So, and he certainly has strong ties with the African-American community, as we saw through the primaries. But at the same time, he's trying to say, look, we've got to respect the police and the military. And he's got strong ties with the military through his son and other things. So he can show culturally, I think, and by the way, he's also a practicing Catholic, which I think is important. So there's just a lot of things he can do just personally to show that culturally he respects the different groups in America. Then there's constantly reinforcing norms. One of the things Donald Trump did incessantly was to break norms. And by breaking norms, that was fun for his followers and actually gave them, and maybe even others, a sense that he was getting things done. But he was a breaker. He was a breaker. He wasn't a creator. And what Biden, I think, will do, and I think you already see him doing, it is he's going to respect norms and he's going to try to constantly reaffirm them. But then probably the most important thing he can do is he can solve problems. FDR got legitimacy back for the presidency and for capitalism because he was, it was a complicated story, but basically successful. And that's what Biden needs to do. He has to combat COVID and beat it quickly. That's why his 100 million standard is a good one. Hope he can do it. And if he can, I think that'll mean that people have a little more trust in government. And then second of all, he's got to make sure he does everything he can to bring an economic recovery. If he can do those two things, that'll help bring people together. However, this is a long, slow process. We have had 40, 50 years of scissoring, breaking apart. We've had a president who's really used the scissoring to create havoc and chaos, as we saw January 6th. And so it's going to take a lot of work and hard effort to bring things back together. By the way, I want to thank Ahmad for the shout out for the Goldman School. I do want to note that I always get a kick out of the fact that when our Goldman School students go over to the business school, we constantly get reports from faculty members there who say things like, your students are so much more analytical than our students. They can do things our students can't. And why is that so? That's because we actually start with harder problems than making a profit for a corporation. We start with problems like, what is the fair and just thing to do in a society? And we give them the tools through economic theory, through political science theory, and through statistical theory to think through problems in a really hard-nosed way. So I'm really proud of our graduates, and I think they're folks who could, I think, be incredibly helpful to people in Silicon Valley as they grapple with some of the big problems that are confronting the social media companies and others in that space.
And Dean Brady, this is Peter Lerome Munoz again with the leadership group. Just to build on that last point, what are some additional steps that companies like our members here today can take to address some of those trust issues from a corporate and technological perspective?
Well, obviously, one of the big things is just figuring out what to do with internet communications and social media communications. And I think it's heartening to see Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and others starting to do that. I don't think anybody yet quite knows exactly the right way to do it, though, and what our standards have to be. But I think there has to be, and I hope it would be short of government regulation, because I worry that if the government becomes the guardians, the question becomes who will guard the guardians. And so one hopes we can find another way. But I think there can be efforts to try to sort of self-police that go far beyond what we've seen. There's been far too little of it, and it's gotten totally out of hand. And there really, I think, needs to be a reckoning in that regard, because otherwise I think there will be regulation that could be really problematic. I think also just a sense that people should start thinking about how can social media be used in a more civic way. And I understand that corporations need to make a profit, but corporations also need to retain their legitimacy. And that might mean that you do something other than just focus on more clicks. You say to yourself, how can we maintain our legitimacy? And maybe that means we've got to show that we are stewards of these systems that we've invented, and that we're going to try hard to make sure that there are mechanisms to short circuit some of the terrible behaviors that we've seen.
Dean Brady, we have a question that was sent to me from a member, and it's about the incoming Biden administration's policies and how it might impact Silicon Valley, but businesses in general. And the question that was sent to me is about President-elect Biden's COVID relief proposal includes raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to your thoughts on the impact that that might have on small businesses and restaurants that are really trying to stay afloat right now during the COVID pandemic.
Well, you know, the constant concern with the minimum wage legislation is that jobs are lost. The research on that actually doesn't show that much of that happens. And indeed, two of our faculty members, Claire Montelieu and Laura Durenencourt, did a study looking at a very large increase in the minimum wage in the 1960s and looked at what kind of job loss occurred as a result of that and found that actually there was very little. And that the biggest effect of that increase in the minimum wage was to increase equity across the races. I think that, yes, I think we've got to separately worry about small business, because small businesses have been enormously disadvantaged and hurt by COVID. And I think we have to think about how to help them. But that's a separate problem from eschewing the minimum wage. I think increasing the minimum wage is a simple matter of actually getting it back to where it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's also a simple matter of justice. And it seems to me it's an easy way to help people at the lower levels of the income ladder actually have a reasonable income. And we need then a separate policy for small business. And if you look at the appointments, Biden has a small business administration head who had talked a lot about how there had to be special programs for small businesses. I don't know that we've actually thought through exactly what they should look like, but one of the things we've done is made the small businesses bear a lot of the burden of COVID. Unlike, by the way, European countries, which supported businesses and not people. We've supported people and not businesses.
Dean Brady, I think we are just about at the close of our time. I wanted to say that this has been incredibly insightful into a very unique American moment where it's really a reckoning, as you rightly point out, for political parties, for government institutions, and for corporations that are working to retain legitimacy. I look forward, as do our members, to continuing this relationship between the Goldman School of Public Policy and the Leadership Group. Thank you so much for your time and all that you do in terms of thinking about these very important issues. Thank you for joining us today.
Great. It's been wonderful to be here. I've really enjoyed it. And I think it's an interesting time, partly because I think we are in a second Reconstruction. And I think the tragedy is that the first one failed, and that I don't think we can afford to fail again as Americans. We have to deal with the issues that confront us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. And thank you all to those who joined. Have a great afternoon. Thank you all.